Well done.
You know, Pokemon spin-offs are something that we might take for granted. I mean, the series has given us loads of really interesting and diverse games over the years, from racing games, tactical RPGs, to art programs on the DS, and with the games we're talking about today, on-rails shooters. Pokemon Snap and its long-sought sequel, New Pokemon Snap, aren't exactly rail shooters in a traditional way though. They're instead focused on snapping photos of Pokemon in a series of diverse courses, where you have to use your different tools and set pieces to try and get the best scoring image of every Pokemon. Even today, it's such a novel concept, and I think that the Pokemon Snap games have something to them that isn't really replicated anywhere else. The original 1998 Pokemon Snap for N64 has gotta be one of my favorites on the system. Taking photos and doing fun interactions with Pokemon in these sort of theme park rides makes for a memorable experience that really resonates with me and I'm sure loads of other fans. Pokemon Snap is one of many Nintendo games that had a long-running cult fan base for decades, begging for a new entry on new systems. And a short 2 decades later, we finally got one on the Switch with New Pokemon Snap. Great name, by the way. But really, if I had to be honest, I never felt like the Switch game connected with me like the original had. Maybe it was released a little too late, maybe I had moved on, but either way, I'd waited years upon years for this new sequel, and it just didn't click with me the way I wanted it to. And so that's why today I wanted to go back and play the original Snap to remember what makes it so special, and then to look at the new Pokemon Snap game to see if there was something I had missed. Pokemon Snap actually had a pretty interesting development. It was created by HAL Laboratories for the N64, but it was made by a separate team that they refer to in-game as Jack and Beans. They had loads of different concepts before they settled on a Pokemon game with photography, but I'm not really going to focus on that stuff, I'm just going to talk about the final game. If you're curious, I'm sure you can look up that stuff on a Wikipedia article or something like that. Pokemon Snap has you playing as Todd, an explorer and photographer that's working with Professor Oak to research Pokemon on Pokemon Island. Similarly to a few spin-offs at the time, Todd and the rest of the characters are all set in the world of the anime, instead of the games. But that's pretty much it for the premise. You're helping Professor Oak, you go through 7 different levels in this all-terrain vehicle they call 01, and you travel around taking photos of Pokemon. Both this and New Pokemon Snap on Switch play fundamentally the same. You follow a set track in the level and have a preset amount of film, with which you can take as many photos as you want before the course is done. You can look around, aim and shoot your camera, as well as use a few items to interact with Pokemon nearby. As those items are unlocked, you'll really start to see what makes Snap so fun. Every level is full of Pokemon doing their thing in different environments, and you can use your items to interact with them. Maybe you'll see an Electrode sitting around, but you can throw your apple-shaped Pokemon food at them, and it'll cause them to explode. And you can even use the food in interesting ways to bring Pokemon to different locations, such as taking this Slowpoke over to a fishing hole and having it catch a Shelder to evolve. Discovering and then setting up new and interesting photos is really the name of the game here. I found myself always looking for new ways to get Pokemon in the exact spot you want them to be, and since the levels are so quick and easy to replay, it makes new discoveries easy to get to. But those apples aren't the only option you have for throwing items. You also have the Pester Ball, which endlessly entertained me as a kid. The Pester Ball lets you do exactly what the name suggests. You can pester the heck out of every Pokemon you see on the course. Pokemon abuse is a real issue, and you can single-handedly be responsible for all of it. You can use this thing for all sorts of applications, like pushing Pokemon around or getting them to yell at you angrily. Enough Pester Balls will even evolve Pokemon like Grimer. It's really great stuff. I think that the interactions with the Pokemon food and the Pester Balls are what make Pokemon Snap tick. Creating these interactions through little secrets that you'll discover adds a layer of complexity that you don't even see in most rail shooters. Maybe you'll get a Pikachu to come up to this egg and bring out a legendary bird, or even chuck balls into these lava pools to get a photo of an Arcanine. And some of these secrets are really hard to find too, like getting a Mankey to kick a Magikarp into a waterfall, which then you can pester into evolving a Gyarados. These sort of interactions are really fun to see, and they're often used to advance to new areas in the game too. Later on, you'll also get a Poké Flute to play some tunes and a booster to speed yourself up to get into positions faster, but they're not really quite on the same level of interactivity. But with everything put together, you've got a great little toolkit that you can take some really fun photos with. It's a little before my time, but back in the day, you could take them to a Blockbuster and have them printed. I never seen one of these booths in person, but the idea of taking your favorite photos and having them printed out as stickers or whatever is really neat. Through the interactions and secret exits, there was a lot of life in the environments you were exploring. They really felt like creatures just going about their day, and having the interactions with them made them feel a lot more real than they ever did in the games, especially at the time. I think Pokemon Snap might be the first game in the series where Pokemon actually just seemed like wild creatures. It felt like the interactions were endless, like Pokemon Snap always had something new that I'd never seen before. Though it's an early 3D game with pretty simplified environments, the interactions allowed it to feel much more lively than it ever really was. I think that the world that Pokemon Snap 64 paints also added a lot to make it so memorable. Each biome is well detailed for a game on 64, and they each have a really fun atmosphere to them. I think visually, Pokemon Snap is just really warm and inviting. Every level at least has something going on around every corner. But Snap's levels are so densely packed with interactions that there's always something to take a picture of, and you'll always have something to quickly snap as you move through the stage. The music tracks that accompany every stage are also surprisingly great. All this isn't to say that Pokemon Snap is without flaws though. If I had to be fair, sometimes the solutions to things to find secrets can be a little ambiguous. I could also expect new people coming back to this game to feel like the controls are a little bit off. Though I think that if you're playing the game through a virtual console or emulator, the aiming might not feel as precise as it is on an actual N64 controller. Of course, as the years have gone on, it's become pretty hard to forget how to do everything, and if you know what you're doing, you can snap all 63 available Pokemon before reaching the end. If you already know where everything can be and what it'll do, it can make things a lot easier for you, but there's also a lot of depth to be found in the scoring mechanic.
Wow, well done! Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful!
After every stage, Professor Oak will take a look at one photo of each type of Pokemon that you took a picture of, and score it based on a few metrics. The size of the Pokemon in the frame and its pose play a big part of the score, but if you have more than one of the same Pokemon, or have them doing a special action in the shot, you'll get even more points. In a lot of levels, you have to use really precise aim and clever timing to get things in position if you want a good photo. I think messing around with the interactions and aiming for new high scores gave Pokemon Snap a level of replayability that made it a staple for my N64. I remember I would just run through those levels whenever I had an hour to kill, and once in a while I would reach a new high score. Replayability, I think, is a huge part of why I look back on Pokemon Snap so fondly. I always felt like I could get a better photo, and it was always just fun to mess around with different interactions, trying to get them in position for a better shot. And I really think that the game's structure plays a big part into this too. The runtime with Pokemon Snap is so short that by the time you have any issues with it, it's already done. Even if I just had a moment, I could replay the entire game from start to finish and rip through the whole thing in less than an afternoon. When I replayed Snap for footage, the game only took me about 3 hours from front to back. Every level only takes about 2 to 3 minutes to run through, and if you know what you're doing, you only have to play them twice. You could definitely argue that the game is a little bit too short, and I think that they could have gotten away with maybe 2 or 3 more levels, but then again, I'd rather be left wanting more than being overwhelmed with content. After those 6 levels, you replay them to get the Pokémon signs, and then you can go to the Rainbow Cloud to throw pester balls until you can catch a photo of Mew. And then boom, it's credits. It's short and sweet, but I think that it holds up really well. However, once Snap was done, that was it. Pokémon Snap was left as it was for over 20 years. It was nice to see Nintendo and Pokémon release the game on Virtual Console every once in a while, but I and so many fans just wanted to see them return to the Snap games with a proper new entry. I feel like I remember the demand really peaking during the Wii U and 3DS era. I mean, you had 2 systems with a gyroscope, a camera, and a screen on them. So it felt like it probably was inevitable that we would see a new Pokémon Snap. But it did end up taking a bit longer than that. It took forever, but eventually we did get new Pokémon Snap on the Switch, and we can get into that now. Alright, so for this one, I think I need to explain how I felt about the game when it first came out. When the game was first released, I was probably like everybody else and just super excited to see Pokémon Snap finally return. But when the game came out, I threw on my copy, played it for maybe the first half of the game, and I felt like something was off. I won't lie, when I first played Pokémon Snap on Switch, I was a little disappointed. I think I set my expectations a little too high, and when I actually played the game, I was given exactly what was on the box, a new Pokémon Snap. Early on, I got the impression that it was more hand-holdy, wasted more time, and had new features that I just didn't really care for. In general, I just didn't click with it. I did eventually come back to finish the game that year, but it took me a long time, and I wasn't really feeling like it was ever going to replace the original Nintendo 64 game. But I always had the sequel in the back of my mind ever since. If I felt like it couldn't live up to the original, but I saw so many people online praising the new version, I felt like maybe I had missed something, and I wanted to be convinced. So here I am, playing the game years later with a little bit of retrospection, and I can say that my opinion has changed a little bit since. So let's get into it. New Pokémon Snap starts you out with creating your own avatar this time, as opposed to just giving Todd a different name, and then you'll end up at the research lab run by Professor Mirror. Instead of returning to Pokémon Island from the first game, you instead explore the Lentil region, a set of islands each with their own distinct climates. Lentil is home to a special Illumina phenomenon, which causes Pokémon to glow and flowers called crystal blooms to spring up. There's a whole plot here with an old captain, explorer guy, and your new research buddies, but really it's typical fluffy modern Pokémon storytelling, so I'm not really seeing anything special going on. You'll help the professor by taking photos and traveling to each area, learning about the special Illumina Pokémon along the way. You also meet a grown-up version of Todd, and I honestly forgot that was a thing in this game, so it was kind of fun to see.
Hey, Professor, it's been a while.
Soon you'll jump into the Neo 1, replacing the Zero 1, and set off for the first level. Right off the bat, you'll see how New Snap has improved on the original. Graphically, the game is pretty well done. Environments and character models are really great, and every environment feels a lot more believable. Some standout sections like the reef level can actually look amazing. The Pokémon on every course are a lot more detailed and well animated than they ever could have been on the N64, but the way they're represented has changed a little bit. While the occasional silly moments do happen, I personally found that New Snap really tried to hone in on the safari aspect of Pokémon Snap. Every area amps up that nature reserve aspect, as opposed to how the original felt a little bit more in line with how the anime was representing Pokemon at the time. There are Bidoof gathering sticks or Hoodoo nesting in trees, instead of Jigglypuff with microphones. The naturalistic approach to levels in New Snap is something that I think I really failed to appreciate my first time around. It feels much less concerned with creating little caricatures and instead focuses on the grandeur of Pokemon as they are in the wild. That isn't to say there are no silly moments in New Snap, or naturalistic moments in Snap 64, but I would argue there is a little shift in tone. I have to say though that this early part of the game really quickly reminded me of the problems I had with new Pokemon Snap. The beginning is way longer and drawn out than I feel like it should be, with a big emphasis on these characters that I don't really have much interest in. You can skip some parts of dialogue, but often you'll end up being railroaded into long sections of text between the new professor and his assistants. And the game will always feel the need to remind you about certain features that you might not even really be interested in, like name tags or stickers and that sort of thing. And it ends up taking so much time to give you them after every level. I don't think that the photo editing or sharing modes are particularly bad additions, but I think that forcing them to be occupying your time just makes them into unnecessary distractions. Something as simple as a consistent skip button would have gone a long way. From the start, it feels like you'll never get out of the nature park, and you'll keep replaying this level effectively for an hour. You play through it once, and then at night, and then you run into the glowy Meganium, and then you think you're done at that point, only to find out you have to play the same level again, but with apples now. I don't even think the actual gameplay is bad in any way. It's just that the way it's delivered gives such a bad first impression and made me feel like the entire game was going to be like this.
Now that you're all here, we can get started. Listen up, team. I'm going to give you a breakdown of the survey.
After making it through that long nature park section, you'll finally start to get into the main gameplay loop. You get to go to the next island and visit the jungle, and soon after the desert and the reef. Along the way, you'll see loads of new Pokemon and also unlock a few tools. Personally, I don't really love the scan function because I find it a little distracting, but I understand its purpose. It does its job to give you more information and also attract Pokemon. I'm mainly referring to the replacement for the Pester Ball, the Lumina Ball. Back on N64, I felt that the Apple and Pester Ball offered a very clear division between positive and negative input, while the new Fluff Fruit and Lumina Ball are both generally positive. You can still bump things a little bit with the fruit, but you're not going to be knocking out a Vulpix here. The new ball's purpose makes sense to me, and it works in the context of the story, but it's a little tacky to me. The Lumina Ball does have its benefits though. It can bring out new Pokemon from hiding or cause special interactions with the Crystal Blooms. Using the right ball in the right place can also enable secret routes and hidden photo ops that were always a treat to find. And also, as a side note, you can no longer evolve Pokemon in the middle of a level, which I feel is a really big loss. I understand why they changed this to match up better with the established IP. It didn't really make sense in the original, but I feel like it was a really concrete, substantial reward when you found out how to do something, instead of simply just getting a cool photo opportunity. They do try to get around it, like in this one section where you throw a ball and you get a Squirtle into a whirlpool, but he's saved by a Blastoise, as opposed to in original Pokemon Snap where they would probably just evolve into a Blastoise. At the time New Snap came out, Pokemon had developed hundreds more species to choose from. The variety in each stage has multiplied, and New Snap has about 4 times the original game's Pokemon. Even if you can't evolve Pokemon anymore, at least there's way more variety. One of the biggest changes is the new 4-star system for the reactions and interactions that you catalog. Instead of each Pokemon being focused on one photo at a time, they instead have 4 tiers of poses to unlock, with 4 stars typically being reserved for the most interesting or dynamic pose. It's really a cool way to add replay value and gives you an incentive to experiment past just taking nicely framed photos. And I really like that each category can also earn a rank in itself from bronze to diamond. But unfortunately, the system is kind of restrictive, and it doesn't let you put more than one Pokemon up for a photo, even if they're in multiple categories. Because of the way this works, I'd be forced to choose between a hard to earn photo or one that could be scoring better. And even if I do prefer one over the other, it just wastes time because now I have to go back and get the other photo from earlier. I think the game would have felt much more streamlined if they just let you put more than one category at once. And my issues with this system are even more multiplied with the addition of research levels. New Pokemon Snap introduced the idea of research levels, which are these sort of things that rank up per level that increases as you take good photos and find new Pokemon. Every time you rank up, you may discover new Pokemon, routes, or interactions. Once again, this is a really cool feature. It makes it so that the first time you enter a level, you can ease into it, and allows stages to evolve as they add new Pokemon. From a game development standpoint, it's also a smart way to reuse the stages, giving the developers more opportunities to add new species without having to make entirely new environments. But despite the good intentions, I found that research levels would constantly get in the way of progression. Since they're also mandatory to grind in order to advance the story, it always seemed like a hurdle to get over instead of a way to make things more replayable and fun. You end up finding yourself replaying levels not because you want to, but because you need to. Research levels can often feel quite similar to each other, where the first level feels like a stripped down version of the second level. I found that Research Level 1 could have just been put into Research Level 2 and made one more cohesive level.
They're the same picture.
If I had to guess, almost every level would force you to replay it at least 2 to 3 times in order to get through it, and that's not even counting day and night versions. I don't even think they had to pad the game out like this. There's plenty of content here between the 200 Pokemon to take photos of and the dozens of courses you can play through. And the night and day stages were already a perfect way to extend the value of every stage anyway, which makes mandatory research levels feel even more redundant. And that's the thing, is the baseline gameplay is still just as fun as it was on the N64. When I first played the game, I completely skipped Research Level 3 because I didn't want to grind for it and I felt like it wouldn't have been worth my time. But after having unlocked a few of them for this video, I found that so much of the best content in the game is tucked behind the third research level. Because of the way research levels roadblock you, I believe that new Pokemon Snap had way less secrets or interactivity than the original game. Pokemon in the first research level often felt tied down, like they don't have as much to do. But by level 3, you get some really fun moments just like in the original game. New Pokemon Snap gave me the impression that there was less interactivity than in the original game, but most of the time it was just put behind a part of the game that you didn't even have to touch in order to finish the actual story. It's a bit ridiculous to find that my issues with the game were more tied to the way the content was delivered as opposed to the content itself. New Pokemon Snap actively hides the best parts of the game from people who don't want to invest the time into it. In fact, a lot of what New Pokemon Snap is doing is entirely improving on the original game. Even if I don't use things like online sharing, there are lots of really good ideas here. Things like alternate routes and stages, or photo requests that function as hints, are all really smart ways to extend the original Pokemon Snap formula. And it's so unfortunate because when I first played the game, I felt like everything was so repetitive and monotonous, but all the good stuff was just hiding in the back. It makes me wish that the research levels all just started at level 3.
Let's call that enough research for now.
This is all really to say that the game has some pacing issues, and I'm not trying to say that you can't enjoy the story for what it is, or have fun replaying levels to improve the research level. But a lot of Snap 64's value for me came out of replaying it. Things like submitting one photo at a time, or grinding out research levels, or skipping through long conversations. All these roadblocks put together make New Pokemon Snap feel like a really good game that's tucked behind a job that you have to do before you're allowed to actually go and explore the levels to their fullest extent. Okay, let's take a break. In no time, you'll find that you've got hundreds of photos taken over the course of the game, and maybe you want to see them printed out like real photos, just like you could with the old Blockbuster Snap machines. And while physical photo printing isn't really as common as it used to be, Fujifilm and Nintendo partnered together to create a new photo printer that works with new Pokémon Snap. And I happen to have one here. It's functionally identical to the standard Instax printers, but the app features Switch connectivity and Nintendo-themed frames. I printed a few just for the heck of it.
Rushing up to it could be dangerous. Be careful.
In New Pokémon Snap, your overarching goal was to capture and study the Illumina Pokémon. And as you go along, you'll encounter each of them before reaching the end of the game. I think they're all fun additions with their own unique challenges, but they can run a little bit too long. Funny enough, these stages are built to add new Pokémon to fill in the gaps, which you would never know if you just played the game front to back. Either way, the Illumina spots function well as boss fights to break up the regular stages. After you capture the 5 Illumina Pokémon, you can make your way to the final level in the ruins. Before you know it, you capture a photo of Xerneas and you've reached the end of the game. After you finish the game, you can return to see a few new levels, some of which were added as DLC after the game released. You can return to the nature park as a miniature and visit a few locations that are reminiscent of the river and valley from Snap 64. They definitely feel like content that was intended to be in the game at launch, with some DLC Pokemon showing up in pre-release trailers. After finishing the game, I felt like I wanted to replay a lot of those levels and find those secrets just like I did in the original game. But I wish it didn't take so long to get there. These stages feel so much better when they're laid out like this. You don't need to grind up experience to unlock new stages, and you can instead focus on finding new secrets and just taking cool photos. You'll be raising the research levels still, but it feels a lot more engaging when I'm free to move and bounce between stages whenever I get bored of one. I think it's possible that New Snap is kind of a victim of its time of release. I wouldn't be surprised to hear that New Snap was designed to get people to stick around as long as possible. It makes perfect sense to me that the developers probably wanted players to dig deep and replay stages dozens of times over in order to stretch that content as far as it could go. I think a lot of people see video games as time per dollar assessments, and I wouldn't be surprised that if a new game was about the length of Snap 64, it would be a massive outrage. But I believe that arranging the contents of a game with the purpose of extending playtime is a zero-sum game. While New Snap was received really well at release, I have a suspicion that people that return to it years later could begin to notice how much padding hurts the game in the long run. I'm not gonna dictate what people can and can't enjoy, but it's just how I feel about it at the moment. Maybe I'm the minority here, but I'd love to know if you felt the same way. It seems to me like New Snap is more rewarding to players who are already in the mindset to engage with the game wholeheartedly, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it makes me feel like it's just trying to monopolize my time. What you're left with after finishing the game, I think, is actually a better product than the game in its actual story mode, which is pretty crazy to think. I think New Pokémon Snap really succeeds at what it wanted to do, but it stumbles in its own delivery. Games like Pokémon Snap are just so rare to see. It's really such a simple twist that led these two games to become incredibly fresh and memorable. They feel like games that could really only work with an IP as expansive and popular as Pokémon. I've never really had trouble going back and playing the first game, and I always enjoy myself when I do so. But I'm also glad that I replayed the sequel. New Snap definitely has its flaws that I personally can't get along with, but I understand that the scope of the game is so much bigger and there's so much more to do. I just wish that I understood that a little bit earlier.
You guys get it, right?
Thanks so much for watching the video all the way to the end. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like down below, give me a comment, say hello, and feel free to subscribe. Doing all that stuff helps other people find the channel and helps support me as I move along and make new stuff. With all that said, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you in the next one.